and generated by such different circumstances. But having said that, there are also extraordinary lines of continuity. And a key continuity is undoubtedly, notwithstanding the one-child policy and things like that, is the sheer importance of the family, one of the two great institutions in Chinese society. The family is nodal, pivotal in Chinese society in a way that it just isn't in the West, in any society anymore. How is it? Well, I mean, there's lots of illustrations I could give you. You know, the Chinese always write their, symbolically they write their name. The family name always comes before the given name. The family name is what matters, not the given name. Marriage is a union of families, not simply a union of two individuals. Chinese parenting, you may be familiar with this, but Chinese parenting is really significantly different from Western parenting. There's a very good book by Howard Gardner, the Harvard educationist, on this. I think he must have adopted a Chinese kid or something because he spent quite a bit of time in China. And you know, he draws the very strong differences. Chinese parenting is much more prescriptive. It's based on a much stronger notion of what is right and what is wrong, and the authority of the parent is much greater than it is in Western societies. Or the position of the elders, the seniors in Chinese society. I mean, by law as well as by custom, it is the responsibility of parents to look after and keep the elders of the family, the seniors of the family. And also, by the way, I mean, and this is not confined by any means to China, but it's common in East Asia, it is a shame-based culture, not a guilt-based culture. Western culture is a guilt-based culture. We need to save, we have to, you know, Jesus Christ, you know, was born on earth to save us from our sins. That is not the way in Chinese society, or in Japanese society, or Vietnamese society it works. It is based on shame, a question of losing face, and so on. And you are socialized via the processes within the family. The Chinese essentially have a much more optimistic, and always have had much more optimistic view of human nature than Westerners. They don't think we're inherently sinful. They think if you're brought up in the right way by your family and by the educational process, there's no reason why you can't be a good person. So that's my second point about Chinese society. This is a fundamental difference, and whatever the enormous changes taking place, this will be in various ways, changing ways, mutating ways. It will remain, it seems to me, fundamental feature of Chinese society. Thirdly, China as a great power. Now, I suppose the assumption is, what will it be like? And the assumption, I suspect, that most of us have, well, somewhere or other, it will be like the United States. That it will exercise the same kind of the power in the same ways as the United States in a situation of global hegemony. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I don't mean they won't have anything in common, of course they will, but I don't think that's right. And I don't think it's right for the following reason. It is true that European and American society, Western societies, share with China a notion of universalism. They think that they both share, both aspects share, the idea that in some way or other they are a model for the world. But the way in which they interpreted historically being a model for the world was profoundly different. For Westerns, for Europeans, because we start with Europeans here, the Europeans interpreted universalism as a desire to expand across the world, to conquer territory, and to civilize the uncivilized, to project and convert their religion, Christianity. I mean, this was what the colonial empires that accounted for such a large percentage of the world from the late 19th century until the middle of the 20th century were about. Now, China's notion of universalism was very different. China's notion of universalism was the land and the heaven, the Middle Kingdom, the most advanced civilization in the world. So why would you want to leave the land under heaven? Why would you want to step out? Chinese have a very strong sense of superiority. Why would you want to step outside heaven, the land under heaven, into darkening shades of barbarianism? So actually, China's notion of universalism was essentially a stay-at-home universalism. So, you know, whereas we worship those, you know, go to any British city and you'll find those who led colonial conquests and so on, their statues littered around the major cities. In China, that never happened. If you stepped outside and migrated, for example, to Southeast Asia, you were stepping outside civilization. You were not deserving the protection of the emperor. Very, very different historical tradition. So the Chinese had no empire. They didn't colonize. Well, the nearest they got to, you could argue that under the Qing dynasty, when they conquered these in the 17th century, that this was a form of colonial expansion. But it was on their own continent, and they never sought to colonize, for example, Southeast Asia and Indochina, which they could have done. Instead, they had something different. They had the tributary system, which I won't go into now, but it did not involve conquest of these territories. So this seems to me a fundamental difference between the experience of the Chinese and the experience of the West. The other difference is this. China's huge. China's got a massive population. Today, 1.3 billion people. It's a population 4 times the size of the United States. Larger than the United States and Europe put together. It's a very difficult country to run. The problem facing all rulers of China in the imperial period and in the communist period is how the hell do you hold it together? Because when you've got a country that large, with that big a population, the centrifugal forces are very, very powerful. And from time to time, of course, they've upset the Chinese apple cart, and they've gone through periods of very difficult conflict. So, the priority of all rulers in China, and I envisage this to be true in the future, now and in the future, will always be, first and foremost, domestic rule. Avoiding chaos. You know, the emphasis on stability and order in China is for a good reason. It's an extremely difficult country to govern. I mean, governing a little island like Britain, in comparison, is a doddle. Governing China is extraordinarily difficult. This is why, in many ways, the Chinese state, and I'll come to this in a moment, is so hugely competent. So, that's my second point, that China will be a different kind of third point, a very different kind of global power. My fourth point is about the state. Now, we think in the West, we get the Chinese state absolutely wrong, in my view. Absolutely wrong. We think that the Chinese state is the Achilles heel of China. You know, why? Well, because it's not democratic. So it's got no legitimacy. We think that the legitimacy of the state is purely and simply a function of democracy. But if you look at these kind of figures, for example, from Tony Sachs' work, he's at the Kennedy School at Harvard, on levels of satisfaction, and they're borne out by the Pew Global Attitudes figures as well. For levels of satisfaction amongst the Chinese with their government, they're extraordinarily high. I mean, the left-hand column, the blue one, is central government, and you see credibility, legitimacy goes down the more and more local you become. But they are extraordinarily high figures, and the Pew figures are the same. Now, how do you explain this, given that China is not in our terms democratic? Well, I would suggest 3 ways of thinking about it. First of all, for the Chinese, the state has a very different meaning and a different relationship to society to the one we have in the West. For the Chinese, they see the state as the embodiment of what the country is. They see the state as the representative guardian of Chinese civilization. It goes back to the question of the civilization state. It's the protector of the unity. If you want to know why Mao, to this day, enjoys such prestige amongst the Chinese, much greater than Deng Xiaoping's ever achieved, even though he was the architect of the economic transformation, it was because Mao did something extraordinarily precious in the eyes of the Chinese. He put the country together again in 1949. He reconstituted the state as the central institution of Chinese society. And even though he screwed up left, right and centre in all sorts of ways, subsequently, for the Chinese, this made him, if you like, one of the great emperors. Now, the second reason that I think the consideration to understand the Chinese state and its relationship to society is that in Western society, we see that state in essentially utilitarian and instrumental terms. What would it do for me? If you think it's going to work, you vote for X. If you don't think they're going to do a good job, you vote for Y, or whatever it is. Now, the Chinese don't really see the state in those terms at all. They see the state in familial terms. They see, Confucius, writing 2,500 years ago, suggested that the model for the emperor was the father. The emperor should act like the father it's obviously a patriarchal society. The model for the role of the emperor was the father in the family. And the Chinese view the state in familial terms. Now, this is so alien to our way of thinking, so profoundly different. But actually, it's not just true in China. In some degree, it's true in Japan, and it's also true in Vietnam, and it's true in Korea, in Confucian societies. Well, the last point, because I want to say it, but I haven't really got time to go into it, is I just want to say something about race, because no one ever talks about race, and it's so important, and it's very important to understand that you can never understand any society in the world unless you understand the process of its ethnic construction. And China is no exception to this. You all know that China's huge, 1.3 billion people, but I bet you didn't know that over 90% of the Chinese think of themselves as one race, the Han. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. It's completely different from the next four most populous countries in the world, India, the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia. They are completely different. They all regard themselves to be multiracial, multicultural. But China doesn't really accept at the edges. Why? Because, well, how did the Han develop? How did this notion of the Han develop? How did this construction of the Han develop? Well, over a very, very, very long historical period. This is why the civilization state notion is so important to understanding the ethnic construction of modern China. If you want me to elaborate, I'll deal with it in questions. Okay. So I just want to, what I'm trying to convey here, I hope with some success, is that China ain't like us. I don't mean there's nothing in common, I don't mean we're not part of humanity, but its historical development is so different. And you've got to remember, that we're very recent compared with China. I mean, China is the longest continuously existing polity in the world. Going back, well, arguably, it's one of the first settled with the Fertile Crescent, the first settled agriculture in the world. So China has a very, very long history, and maybe instead of people being surprised about China's rise now, this is the wrong way of looking at it. What we should be surprised about, maybe, is not the period since 1978. But what the hell went wrong between 1800 and 1949? Because for the most of the rest of the thousands of years of Chinese history, it was arguably one of, and often the most advanced country in the world. So you could say it is a return to what China is, and the Chinese think of it like this in many ways. We are returning to where we have always